All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. If this is your first time joining us for a live Zoom, thank you very much. I hope that while I'll use the CViConnect system for most of my demonstrations, whatever system you choose, I hope the information that we share today will be of value to you. I am Stephanie Steffer. I am the business director with CViConnect, and my background is as a teacher for the visually impaired for 10 years. In addition to my VI teaching certification, I'm also endorsed in early childhood education, and I'm also a CVI ranged Perkins-Roman endorsed professional. Before we begin, I love if in the chat you guys could just tell me what your role is in addition to being a CVI educator. Are you a PT, OT, speech, TVI, O&M? Whatever your role might be or where you're from, if you could drop that information in the chat. I always like seeing who I have with me as we continue through today's session. So I'm going to continue on while you guys share that information, and I'll check the chat here in just a second. I ask that while we're going through today's presentation that everyone remain muted. It just makes it easier so everyone can hear what I have to say. And then at the end, we will go back and answer any questions from the group. So at that time, I'll let people unmute and ask questions, or I'll check the chat and answer questions from there. I know the way my brain works is when I think of a question, I need to jot it down so I don't forget. So feel free to drop that in the chat as we go if you'd like, and I'll check those and answer those at the end. As I mentioned, I am recording today's session, and after I've added closed captioning, we will have this video uploaded to our YouTube channel, and I'll post the link in the chat in just a bit if anyone of you would like to go back and watch some of our previous sessions. Let me check that chat and see. Hi, Sarah. I'm so glad you're able to join us today. Thank you. All right, so today our main focus is going to be on adding sounds to our activities. And when we're considering adding sound to an activity, we need to be really careful and purposeful in how we choose sound. So I like to think about our sounds as feedback. And so there are three different types of feedback for us to consider. And you'll notice that on the screen, I've only shown you two so far. That's content or cognition and reward. And we'll discuss that third one later in the presentation. But for the first two, content or cognitive feedback is reinforcing the skill that the student is working. So something like, remember to touch each word as you read "the cat hides." So as you're reading the sentence, you're reminding the student to touch as they move along. That would be that content-specific feedback. So here are we using sound as a mean for access to the child with CVI? We also know that the information a child with CVI processes through auditory access can provide the child a great deal of depth and breadth to the concept that they're working on. And that is when we would like to use this type of feedback. Another great example would be using Dr. Roman's ideas of salient features and comparative thought, and to build that into one of our activities. Another option would be, are we using our sounds for a reward? So a rewarding feedback would be something like someone saying great work, or in that case, it's a little voice that comes over and says you win. That makes it more gamified. And according to a recent study by Cornell, researchers Caitlin Woolley and I might butcher this name, so I apologize, Ayelet Fishback, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, people who received these frequent rewards immediately upon the task, completion of the task, will stay intrinsically motivated to perform well and continue completing tasks, even when the reward is no longer offered. So frequent rewards, as you work, make it more positive experience overall, which naturally motivates one to continue the task and perform well. So regardless, though, of what we're adding as auditory input, we also must be prepared that this extra input is likely then to disrupt or prevent visual attention when we're working with kids with CVI. Adding sound will likely increase the complexity of that sensory environment, naturally. So what's the complexity? If you guys haven't seen this yet, this is the complexity framework by Matt Tejan. And if you're not familiar with his work, I highly suggest you watch his webinar. That information is just absolutely amazing for understanding this entire framework. But I will be happy to post again that link in the chat later if you guys would need his link to his framework. I'd be happy to do that. But in a very brief synopsis, Matt is explaining for us that we need to evaluate not only the task that we're asking the student to complete, but also the environment in which they are completing the task. So the evaluation of the task and the environment, the team will utilize these two charts shown and circle the level for each component. And then the highest circle will determine the overall complexity. And you may find that in a general education classroom where the environment is more complex, there's lots more sounds, children moving around, different peers, things like that, that the learner with CVI can only handle maybe an array of 2 items, where in the resource room or in an independent workspace and the environment is more controlled, the student may be more successful and can interpret an array of up to 6 items. So speaking of overall complexity, if you have never seen this before, this might be overwhelming. And even though Matt has done a great job of adding color and coordinating the different levels, let me reduce this complexity by showing you just maybe one chart at a time. So now we've just got one of his charts here. And so now you should be getting a lot of like classroom noise, background noise, things that would be kind of distracting. And I don't know about you, but if this was the first time I had ever seen Matt Tejan's What's the Complexity Framework, that background noise that we're now hearing could be extremely difficult to focus on and understand what's happening in this chart. So let me reduce the complexity a little bit more. So now we just have a single bit of the chart, and you no longer have that extra background noise, which makes it a little bit easier for you, hopefully, to understand what's going on. And even though I've added visual, I've added those sparkles and things, maybe that still isn't helping. Maybe I know that you're looking, but are you still able to interpret? So I would definitely need to make sure I turned off the sound in order to make sure that you have a better option of interpreting the visual target. So obviously when we create an activity, we aren't going to use classroom background noise, I would imagine. We're probably going to use more things, as we mentioned earlier, the content or the reward type feedback. But if that was the current environment your student was in, what would you do to kind of help modify that extra sound? Well, hopefully you're thinking I'd reduce the complexity of the sensory environment and say, move into a quieter room or an independent workstation. So we've stopped that noise. Okay, now it's quiet. So I can't tell if you're looking, I'm going to add some movement for you. And since I know that I got your visual attention, or at least I'm hoping I did, now you've looked, and so I've added some reward, right? Is that the great time for the reward? So hopefully you're thinking that based on this experience, you know, or I know that you've looked at some time, and you can explain to me now exactly how to determine if the task meets the frustration level for the student. So you've totally interpreted this chart, you know how to use it, and can explain it to others. And if you're telling me no, that just must mean that you weren't paying attention or that you're misbehaving at this time while you're taking this webinar with me. We've all heard those poor assumptions made for our poor learners with CVI, and they do nothing to help our students. Often it's not that they're just not paying attention or that they're not or that they are misbehaving. It's that the task is just too complex. And then given in the right environment and time to read it without me talking or making things shake for no reason or adding air horns or what have you, you'd be likely to be able to interpret the chart without any issue and actually utilize it the way it's intended. I hope for you that through this example, you can see we can't just throw CVI characteristics at kids. We can't just make things move and add lights to it. We have to be purposeful and align everything we're using with their needs. We also can't assume that just because they looked at a target that means they're interpreting it. So we need to make sure that we allow that extra latency time for them to not only look at it, but begin to interpret that target before we use those reward times, those reward sounds, or that content feedback. We also must know that our students and align their accommodations with intention. Using these tools, it's important to provide CVI friendly, accessible school day and help avoid visual fatigue and potential CVI meltdowns. So now we'll talk about how sound will be activated. We have to consider what types of feedback and their possible impact on kids with CVI. However, in order for us to add them into the CViConnect PRO activity designer, or other activity, in that case, whatever you use, we must also consider how and where. And so in this case, how will the sound be activated? In CViConnect, the two most common uses of sounds can either be activated as soon as the activity started, such as this: when I turned the slide, the sound automatically began, or it could be that when I click on it or touch on something that a target is played. And the same way works in CViConnect. So let me show you. If you were to create an activity and you want the sound to play right from the start, on the left side of the screen, you'll see the step-by-step instructions. And on the right side of the screen, I'll actually play a video along with this so that you can kind of monitor and follow along as I explain it to you. So when you're in your activity designer, the first thing you're going to do is on the far right-hand side of the activity, I'm kind of drawing in red right now, there's these three dots, or like the more options. And so you're going to click on that, and that is going to open up this menu here. And the next thing you're going to click on is activity properties. So then once you've clicked on activity properties, and then you'll click events, activity start. Now this screen is our Blockly designer. And then at the very bottom down here, you'll see common, appearance, motion, audio visual. And so you're going to click on the audio visual tab. And when you do, this menu will pop up of all these different options you have. And you can select from the source of your sound and drag it up into the designer. And that is how you'll get a sound to play from the start of your activity. So similarly, when you want an activity to play when touched, in this case, I have something, I've added a star to the activity. And now I want it to play when the student or the CVI moderator touches the star. And so what I'm going to do is, I myself, I'm going in the activity designer, I'm going to touch on the item. So in this case, the yellow star, and then I'm going to use the hammer and wrench, the tools option in the upper right-hand corner next to those three dots that we just worked on a minute ago. And when I do that, I get this box that pops up. And the bottom, I'll see a tab that says properties and then events. And I want to touch the one that says events. And so now I'm going to touch touched. So that's saying that when this item that I'm working on is touched, I want the following things to happen. So again, we're working on sound. So we're going to touch the audio visual tab. And again, you'll drag up the source of the sound that you wish to use. So you can scroll through and select the one that is most appropriate for your student. And then at the end, you'll click done in the lower right-hand corner, and that will activate your selection. So speaking of sound sources, now that we know about those two options, let's talk a little bit more about where your sounds will come from. So in CViConnect, we allow you to use system sounds, and these are things like sound effects, cheers, horns, success sounds, whistles, etc. And so you have that as a built-in option.
Yellow square.
In this case, you could have the Siri speak something, so you could tell the system what you want Siri to say, and she will announce it for you. There are some speech options as far as rate and voice that go along with this option as well, and I'll show you how to do those in just a minute. Then the third option we offer,
I see a balloon,
is actually where you can record your own sound. So in this case, I recorded my voice talking, reading the sentence, I see a balloon. And so as my student would touch on the sentence, I would read it to them, providing that text to speech output instead of them having to use the Siri voice. Now, you could also import songs or what have you. You can record whatever sounds you want that you think would be most appropriate for your student. But what other factors should we consider when we're considering our sound sources? Just as we put as much thought into characteristics of visual inputs, we need to ensure that when a student is beyond what Dr. Roman considers phase one, that they're not just looking. So we're beginning to interpret those visual targets, right? And so we must also consider the learner's ability to not only hear, but interpret the sound. So for example, I have once used that sound, which to me sounds like a crowd cheering. But for one of my students, he had no idea what that was. And so his affect didn't change at all when we would play that. But when I played things like a horn or a whistle, because that was meaningful for him, and he had heard that before when he had done well, or a teacher's voice saying, "Great job." And that intonation, that inflection in our voices, he would smile when he would hear that. But when we used this cheering response, it was like nothing. And we thought, I don't know if he realizes that we're rewarding him by using this sound, which means it's not meaningful, right? If someone comes up to you and says something more flat in their voice, good job, you're not sure that they really mean it, right? So it has to be a meaningful input, whether you're using content or reward. You still need to make sure it's meaningful for your students. So your sounds should be just as meaningful and intentional as your visual targets. And for some children, we need to consider when we're using the recordings or the speech input, some kids can't tolerate that speech, that sound of Siri's voice. They don't like that computerized voice. And even though we offer things like the speech rate or the change in voice from a male to a female and things like that, that still might not be best for your students' individual needs. So it's just some food for thought and some things for you to consider. And like I said, you can change the rate too. So maybe you need to speak faster or slower. It's up to your individual students' needs. And then a final consideration when recording a sound is how long that sound is going to last. It's important for you when you're recording a song that you don't, like if you're doing a quick cheer or your voice reading a sentence, it's going to end when your voice ends or when that sound ends. But if you're doing a song, for example, if you had something, it would be extremely difficult, too long, and you might lose the main intent of having that feedback, and too short, and you might not get the value or the purpose of that auditory feedback. So you kind of have to play that tricky level there between the two. So this next part here is how to include that system sound. All right, so in here, you're going to enter the Blockley system just the same way you would before, whether you're going to the three dots or you're touching on an item. So it depends on how you want it to be activated. And in this case, I went through the idea that someone was going to touch on the star. So either way, you're going to get into this Blockley space, this white space here we call our Blockley designer. Okay. And again, you're going to click on that audiovisual tab, just like you did before. And now that you're here to get a system sound, on the far left, you're going to click on the one that says play cheer. And you're going to just touch and drag it up into that empty white space above. And then once you do, you can select from the drop-down menu, and you'll see there are different things built in that you can utilize so that when the student touches the star, the horn will play. The next one is for the system to speak. So again, we're here already in our Blockley designer, and this could have been set up at the beginning of an activity or for when touched, just like the other ones. But now that we're in here, we're going to use the audiovisual tab. And then we're going to select from the options. I'm going to scroll to the right here, and they say something. So now I can drag up any of these options, and you'll notice that some of them say something, what to say with voice. And so that's a drop-down menu that I can select different voices. And if I scroll back to the left here, you'll see this one says with speech rate. And so I can choose fast or slow. Those are those options we just talked about. And then once I find the one that I want, I can just touch and drag it up. And then what I'm going to do is there's this box that says what to say. And then currently it says hello world. Well, that's not the text I want it to say. So I'm going to erase that and replace it with what I want the system to actually say to me. So instead, I could write in star. I could write in yellow star. Whatever it is that I want Siri to say, I can change. And now using those drop-down menus, just by touching them, I get my options. So in this case, I'm going to select slow, and then I can change the voice option too. So now when I click done and go back into my activity, if I were to run the activity, when someone touches the star, you would hear the voice star in a slow man's voice. Computerized, of course, not human, but that's the option we have. So the next option is one of my favorites, and this is the recorded file, because I tend to find that because my voice is familiar to students and the computerized voice just doesn't always work for all kids, that I prefer to use my own voice when possible. Now, it does add an extra element where if you're recording something, you need to have a quiet environment to do so. So that adds a little bit of a complication. But I do feel like for my students, it's been a little bit more meaningful, but it is a two-step process. So the first thing that we have to do is record the sound. And then secondly, we'll have to go into that Blockly Activity Designer and actually tell the activity how we want to use that sound. Okay. So the first thing here is we are going to record the sound. And to do that, we're going to touch the three dots or the more options button on the far right-hand side. And then you'll see the third one down says sound library. So you're going to select that. And here your sound library will start off as empty because you haven't added anything in there yet. And then on the bottom left-hand side, there's this plus. So you're going to add new. And now you're in your new sound pop-up box, okay? So the first thing that you're gonna do is name your sound. You just delete the text that's currently in there and replace it with the name of the sound that you would like. Then you'll go down to description, and again, you can change the description of it. And then when you're ready to record, you'll just press the button that says record. You'll say what you want to say, and then you'll press save. I guess I did it a little out of order. I always like to say who is talking in there. So all of these options, when you're saving these in your sound library, are made available to everyone in your district that's using the CViConnect platform. And so if you have someone who just is really great at making these activities and these sound files, and you're using something repetitively throughout your district, they could then share those sounds. Well, if I'm making something and the student doesn't know me and maybe Sarah doesn't want it to be my voice, then maybe I would have to rename it or use a different description. Maybe Sarah also has a spot where she said hello to her students and you specifically want it to be Sarah's voice. Then you would make sure you describe that in either the name or the description so that whoever is using that sound file is using it correctly. Now, before you leave this box, it's really important that once you've pressed save, if I back up just a little bit in the video, you'll notice that under the word key, it says not set. And then once I click save, it gives me my little spinning wheel, and then that key becomes this weird jargon of detail. But what that is a specific assignment for this sound that the system needs. And so I'm going to press copy. And when I do, that's when I can now take that. It's going to be saved on my computer, or my iPad rather. And now I can go to the next part and actually tell the activity how to use it. So again, I need to go into Blockly by either going into the activity start or when touched. And so when I go to the properties and then events, I can click when touched. Now to delete this, I previously had cheer set up. I'm going to delete that, just drag it over the trash can. And when the trash can gets larger like that, I can just drop it and delete it. Now I can go to audio visual and I can drag up play sound given key of, and in that little white box, I'm going to touch, it's a text box, and I can just paste in that key that I just copied and hit return and done. And just like that, when I go to run the activity, if I were to touch it,
Hello.
hopefully you guys heard that you could hear my voice saying hello. Okay, and so the last thing that I want to share with you is that third type of feedback. I said in the beginning that there were three, and I only shared two of them with you, that cognitive and the reward option. And so the third option is the elaborative feedback. And so in 2018, there was an NIH research study about elaborative feedback, and it was called Elaborative Feedback Engaging Reward and Task Relevant Brain Regions Promoting Learning in Pseudo Word Reading Aloud. So, and I can share this link as well if anyone's interested in looking up more of that research. But essentially, what I found is that they compared elaborative feedback to content feedback and reward feedback. And while reward feedback and content feedback both had positive outcomes, they found that elaborative feedback focuses on both skill-related content and praising instances and of the correct application of the skill. So elaborative feedback would be something like, oh, I like how you touch the words as you went along. We have to remember to do that. And so you're rewarding and giving that cognitive piece as to what it is that you're expecting from the child as they did it. And I think that's really important because that's what Dr. Roman explains to, and even Matt Tejan, when you talk about asking them the what do you see question. So you're building on what their answer is. Oh, I see how you could think it was an elephant because it's gray. But let's look here. Does it have big floppy ears and a long trunk? Okay, so it's probably not an elephant. Let's take another look and see. And so you're kind of tying onto what they're seeing and elaborating it a little bit more. So you're providing both that reward, that content, and then extending that knowledge even further. And so, as we already know, children with CVI benefit from that mediator who can extend comparative thought and salient features and who understands the impact of those 10 visual and behavioral characteristics as they relate to a specific learner. But evidence like this on elaborative feedback further supports how important it is for in the moment feedback to be provided to the student based on their responses and the greater impact it would provide for that learner. Depending on the nature of your school service delivery, you might not always be the one with the child, but that doesn't mean that you cannot use this to help further educate your teams in order to work from a whole child approach. So, and with that being said, I hope that as you are listening to my thoughts on auditory feedback, it gets you thinking about your service delivery and how you utilize auditory feedback with your students. I always love to hear more about what you think, whether you agree, disagree, maybe you have questions. Please feel free to reach out. My contact information is shown on the screen, and I've also put that in the chat for you. Before we all log off our meeting today, I just want to remind everyone that these videos are all posted on our CViConnect YouTube channel, and I've just posted that link in the chat. Be sure to check that out and make sure you like and subscribe to our CViConnect YouTube channel to ensure you get notifications when our new videos are available. And like I just said, I'm open to some conversations about how you think about your auditory feedback for your students. So feel free to comment below in this video and let's have an open dialogue. In order for us to continue moving forward as a field, we must continually ask questions and analyze how we're doing things. Let's read some new research and find a better way to support our students. With that said, thank you all for joining me and thank you for watching CViConnect Presents Auditory Feedback for Learners with CVI.